Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start our What is SQFI Ethical Sourcing 2.0 and Why You Need It webinar. My name is Sarah Milenich, and I'm the Marketing and Sales Senior Manager, and I want to welcome you all and thank you very much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few minutes to go over our standard webinar protocol. First off, I would like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it will take some time to process, but should be on our website within about a week or so. You will see a link to the recording posted on the Events tab of sqfi.com and sqfiethicalsourcing.com. Just to say that one more time, this webinar will be recorded and posted to our website. Second, if you have any questions for the speakers during the presentation, please feel free to write them into the chat box that is located on the right-hand side of the screen. I will be fielding these over to the speakers as they come in, and will have them answered at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Eagle Certification Group, for sponsoring this webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Robert Garfield, our Senior Vice President of SQFI, to go over some of the history about our ethical sourcing standard and where we're going in the future. Bob?
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. This is an exciting time for SQF and the ethical sourcing program. We've come a long way since it was first introduced in 2010, and it was envisioned in 2009 by Walmart in cooperation with SQF to develop this program. We looked at it in 2010 and we decided towards the end of 2010, even though there were about 150 current certifications of ethical sourcing under version 1 of the program, that there were some missing parts to it. And so early in 2011, we put our heads together, we formed a committee and decided that we would gather some experts in the field of environmental health and safety auditing, and we will ask them to go ahead and take the program and make it more robust. And so we hired the speaker today, Steve Brown, who has over 30 years experience in auditing in the aerospace and automotive industry, who's done these types of audits for a number of years, and another auditor who also had, Mike Arbaugh, another auditor who had over 30 years experience. And we gave them what we had and we said, go ahead and make this into a program that is more than just an addendum to an SQF food safety audit. And especially we wanted to make the auditor requirements more robust and make sure that anyone that's getting audited under the ethical sourcing program really had the capability of an auditor who understood these kinds of systems. And so we've worked on that for the last 2 years and developed the program. The program is now complete. We have a website, as many of you probably are well aware. We also have a new database that can be used for this certification. And we currently have 4 certification bodies that are interested in the program. That's Eagle, Registris, Silica, and ProCert, and Perry Johnson, who are all certification bodies that are now going to be licensed to do the program. Several others have inquired about the new program. So where does that leave us? We have some facilities that have gotten audited. Again, the website's done, the database is done, the program is ready to go. And yesterday I went down to Bentonville and met with representatives from Walmart, because the question has come to me from a number of suppliers, is this recognized by Walmart? We had a good conversation with them, and they have also toured the Musco Olive facility, which you're going to hear from Dennis Linkman later today about Musco Olive and their their experience with the new program. So we've come a long way. We have further to go, but we're very excited about the program, and we're going to use the rest of the program today to learn more about what ethical sourcing version 2 is all about. So I'm now going to turn it back to Sarah so she can introduce our first speaker. Sarah?
Thanks, Bob. First up is Steve Brown. Steve has over 30 years of environmental health and safety experience in manufacturing and 6 years of environmental health and safety consulting experience. He has held positions at the facility, division, business group, and corporate levels, including 20 years of global responsibilities. These positions have provided the opportunity to gain experience in the following industry sectors: aerospace, agricultural products, automotive, building products, chemical and petrochemical, food and beverage, glass, material technologies, paint resistant, paper, pharmaceuticals, plastics, and primary and secondary metals. Wow, Steve, that's quite a resume, spanning 37 U.S. states and 26 countries. Steve's professional focus includes a strong emphasis on the role of culture as the foundation, and coupled with excellence in management systems and behavioral processes as the mechanisms for continual improvement. Management systems experience includes implementation, training, and auditing responsible care, OSHA Voluntary Protection Program, OSHA Process Safety Management, EPA Risk Management Programs, company-specific environmental health and safety management system schemes, ISO 14001, and the list goes on. Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start by giving you a little background of, some of you are certainly familiar with this, but a little background on where the code, how it came into existence and where it is headed, why it headed that way. Originally, there were requests from a growing concern of consumers, not only about food safety, pricing, value to cost, et cetera, but growing concerns about what are the standards of welfare for folks who are bringing, involved in the whole process of bringing this food to my table and my family's table. What are the environmental conditions under which things are produced and transported and handled? And that pressure, that concern started to find its way into the concerns of suppliers and retailers to make sure that their standards were appropriate to meet expectations. That gave rise to the original Ethical Sourcing Code. The official publication was in January 2010. Certainly, there were documents out in activity in 2009. And that was an attempt to make sure that SQF certified suppliers at the time, food code certified suppliers, had the ability to demonstrate to their consumers, their customers, that there was an independent assessment of their commitment in the areas of responsible trading, labor, care, and environmental practices. As we all know, the only constant is there are no constants, and things continue to evolve. And we now have coined a new phrase, a prosumer world, which tends to be less reactive and certainly more proactively involved in protecting the environment and looking at safe work practices and conditions, labor practices, fair trade practices, et cetera, from companies involved in the entire supply chain of the food process. And sometimes that gets demonstrated in activities such as flash boycotting of businesses that do not demonstrate ethical business practices as perceived by the prosumers. So we're all in this boat together. We all have food on our table, and we all have these types of evolving concerns. In order to answer this question, why an accredited, and I'll come back to the accredited portion in just a minute, why an accredited standard, I would like you to think about, if you have not looked at this investigative report that was produced by the Los Angeles Times The Times reporter and a photographer went to Mexico, looked at several mega farms, found that there were some fairly harsh conditions, exploitative conditions involved for folks who are working to produce or at least harvest products that end up on our family's tables. They put this out in a 4-part series. I would encourage each of you, I'm going to talk just a little more about it, but I would encourage each one of you, please, to go to open up your web browser and key in Los Angeles Times product of Mexico, and it will take you right to the URL for that situation. What it showed, and it mentions some companies by name, some distributors by name, some U.S. companies by name. And the reason I use this example is not to point any fingers at any company and say they're good, bad, or indifferent. What I want you to come away with from what I'm going to say here in the next couple slides is that there are certainly risks throughout all of your supply chains. And how do you address those risks? In this particular study, focused on one Mexican agribusiness in this report, they found abusive conditions, and they found that by looking at public records, private market data, interviews of folks who were involved in various stages of the process. And in this one example, they found 80 million pounds of tomatoes that were exported during the 2014 harvest season, along with bell peppers and cucumbers, as the slide notes. Found their way into primary distributors, 2 in California, 1 in Mexico. And you can see the next tier, these distributors were providing various peppers, tomatoes, et cetera, to a couple of U.S. retailers, a couple of grocery chains, a couple of restaurant chains, some pretty large companies across the United States. And again, the point is not to finger point at these folks, but to say, according to this next slide, they focused in multiple what are certainly sensitive areas: child labor, national regulations, violations potentially of national regulations, indentured labor, folks starting out in debt, finishing the harvest season at least in the same level of debt or more in debt, and not really being able to go home with money in their pocket. Pay practices that in many cases withheld pay from folks, in some cases penalized them, in some cases armed guards kept people from leaving until the harvest season was over. Company stores, I have a little bit of white hair, and I remember company stores related to the U.S. mining industry, and it's a lot of that concept is alive and well, unfortunately, or not well, whichever the case, in other parts of the world. Safety and health conditions from both working and living situations were not very good. All of these represent some potentially significant supply chain risks for various companies. So in response mostly to the evolving conditions that I mentioned on an earlier slide, but certainly dovetails right in with the slides on the Product of Mexico investigative report, SQFI decided to, as Bob mentioned earlier, make the standard more robust. So several things were done. First of all, there was more of an alignment with the SQF food code. It's separate from the food code. It's still voluntary. It's not required of SQFI food code certified companies. I want to make sure that's emphasized and understood. But more of an alignment so that the structure of the code was more familiar. And so in terms of the audit methodology, duration, scoring levels, having 3 levels of certification, and those types of topics, it was more closely aligned with the food code. It also drew from some ISO codes. ISO 14001 is the environmental management system. OSAS 18001 deals with occupational safety and health. ISO 10014 deals with recognizing the economic benefits of these types of programs. And then finally, it was aligned very closely and ultimately accredited to ISO IEC 17021, which is the management system standard that deals with the environmental auditing. So the food code is aligned with 17065. The ethical sourcing standard is aligned with 17021. We are in the process of wrapping up benchmarking of level 3 of the ethical source. Excuse me, just a minute. Level 3 of the ethical sourcing standard with the Global Social Compliance Program. We hope to have that wrapped up next month, actually. And as I mentioned earlier, the code or standard is now accredited by ANSI ASQ, which is a national accreditation board, has international recognition also. So before I dive into the structure and the content of the standard, I would like to go back and just touch base on what the standard is not. First and foremost, it's not a silver bullet. It's not intended to provide immediate results. These types of management system approaches take some time. There might be some culture changes that need to take place, some structural, some resource changes, et cetera, that need to be put into place, but it's the start of the process. It's not the end of the process. It's not designed to replace other standards that apply to assuring good social and EHS practices. Now, it could, in some cases, be used in place of, but it's not intended. And the reason I say that is there are some of you folks who have perhaps sourcing organizations or other entities in your supply chain or your business that require you to have certification or approval to one standard or another. It's not intended to displace those, but in the absence of a particular business driver, I think after we finish our discussion, you'll see that it covers a lot of ground and may serve your organization well. It does not address all factors that a person might consider as ethical. For example, it does not address the humane treatment of animals. It strictly deals with 4 topical areas that I'm going to cover in just a minute. It doesn't represent maximum standards, does not prevent an implementer from going beyond compliance, beyond whether it's regulations or international standards. And again, it is not mandatory for SQF certified sites. It is, however, an internationally accredited standard, and I think that's very important because it's one of the few standards in this area that do have international accreditation, which means it is a recognized management system that's intended to drive continual improvement throughout your organization. It does provide documented third-party assessments in these 4 primary areas: supplier and subcontractor management, social management, environmental, and OHS is the occupational health and safety management area, and business management. And again, it does include requirements that are intended to drive continual improvement. It also is intended to assure independence. For example, each element of the accredited system, start with the accreditation bodies, ANAB and JASANS, they accredit the management system scheme, but they are independent from SQFI. Certification bodies, Bob mentioned earlier, there are 4 that have already registered and a couple more that have expressed strong interest. They conduct the audits. They actually have the auditors that come out and take the third-party look to make sure that you meet the requirements of the standard and your own requirements. And they also operate independently from SQFI. And then SQFI develops the standard. They're the scheme owner. They monitor the performance of the CB and auditor performance and set the qualification standards for auditors. But it's really the certification bodies and the accreditation bodies that can more manage the nuts and bolts of the process. Okay, moving on to talk a little bit about the structure of the standard and the appendices that support it and some of the requirements. Version 2.0 starts with Section 1, talks about the scope. Section 2 talks about some reference documents and standards. Section 3 talks about definitions. And then Section 4 really dives into the requirements. So you have 5 sections, and I'll talk just a little bit to give you some flavor for what's included in these. Commitment starts with a policy that is generated and subscribed to and signed by senior management of the organization. If it doesn't start at the top, it doesn't start, and that's very typical of many processes. Secondly, it's the policy represents good words on the wall, but good words are only good words unless you bring them down off the wall and put them into action. So there is a requirement to have an operations manual that describes the procedures, practices, policies that support your overall ethical sourcing policy. It flows on from there to ensuring that there is a senior management representative that is designated to lead the effort. Now, realizing that the person will be more on a steering level, not on an operational day-to-day level, but it's not looking to have a person that's multiple levels down in the organization to be responsible for ethical sourcing. Quite frankly, there's too much at stake. So the senior management person would be responsible. There's also an allowance for a team of folks who would be involved perhaps in these content areas as more specialists, and making sure that those folks have the appropriate training, that they understand they have this responsibility, they're held accountable just the way that you would hold folks accountable in the other excellence area of your organization. Moving from there into suppliers and subcontractors, I rather sheepishly say that there's only 3 requirements in 4.2. That's to have evaluation and selection criteria for suppliers, for new suppliers, at least to start with, and certainly down the road as contracts come up to bridge those requirements to your existing supplier and subcontractor base, to evaluate those folks on a periodic basis, and to keep good records of those evaluations. Sounds very simple. I realize that it may certainly not be that simple. It depends a lot on the size of your organization, how much leverage you may have, how far your reach extends into your supply chain, how many growers you have, how many links in the supply chain, whether they're right next door, 3 states away, or an ocean away. And so it's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to be able to influence every level, but the intent and the hope would be that over time, these requirements and these standards would cascade throughout the supply chain, and that's the rising tide lifts all boats concept, that over time, everybody's standards would be raised as a result. So it's only 3 requirements, but there's a lot in those requirements. Social management programs deal more with topics related to anti-discrimination in employment, pre-employment and post-employment, non-harassment, non-bullying type requirements. It also deals with wages. It also deals with living conditions. If the organization is supplying living quarters for workers, fair labor practices, terms of employment, etc. So there's what might be called typical employment-related topics or human resources-related topics fall under the social management programs. 4.4 deals predominantly with environmental and occupational health and safety management programs. The concept here is very similar to the HACCP approach, where you identify what are your risks, analyze those risks and prioritize those risks, and put controls in place to address your most significant risks, and over time to cascade those controls throughout your risk assessment process in order to reduce risks over time, in this particular situation to the environmental considerations and health and safety considerations. But that technique and that expectation also applies to social management programs and to supplier and subcontractor considerations. 4.5, monitoring and management review, I think bridges off of the concept that if you can measure it, you can manage it. It involves having a good internal process, internal audit process. It involves having programs to track, record, and address employee concerns and considerations. It talks about monitoring and measurement. What are critical factors? What are, for example, what equipment, machinery do we have throughout our processes that needs to be maintained, calibrated, inspected, et cetera, to make sure that we can achieve all of the risk reductions and meet the controls that we've established. It talks in particular, the second part of 4.5, management review, is senior management at various levels of the organization. It could be a facility level, the next level in your organization up to your home office or corporate group, to make sure that on some periodic basis that performance in ethical sourcing is being reviewed. How well are we doing on implementing programs and processes? How well are we doing in identifying and controlling risks throughout the organization, throughout the supply chain? And then 4.6, lastly, addresses business management principles. This goes back to my comment on ISO 10014, making sure that your organization identifies, and we're going to talk about this a little later in the program, there are definite benefits that can be derived by implementing these types of programs and processes, from differentiation from in the market to certainly economic benefits to more social program benefits, perception, image, et cetera. So we're going to talk a little bit about those as we move forward. The standard itself is supported by 4 appendices. The first is, in Appendix 1, is the certification assessment requirements. These are really the specific requirements for each of the 3 levels of the standard. And I'll give you some examples of that in just a minute. That is, and we'll talk a little bit about how to move from one level to another as we move along in the slides also. Appendix 2 is the implementation and auditing guide. This is a lengthy document that it has a considerable amount of good information. It starts with talking about what are considered to be good environmental practices, or ethical, social practices. So it gives examples for the reader to understand. It then takes each of the requirements of the standard and provides 2 sections. One of them is on what's really expected. What does this look like? What are some examples? What, at the end of the day, are the kinds of considerations that I should make sure I have implemented? And then the second part is the auditing guidance. So from an auditor standpoint, what are the primary, not everything, because you don't want the document to grow to hundreds of pages, but what are some of the main considerations that as an auditor I would be looking at as I look at this particular requirement of the standard? Now, if you think about that as an implementer or a site that's implementing the standard, you can also use that section to say, what are some of the primary focus areas that the auditors will be looking at when they come in? Okay, that's always a good thing. Appendix 3, the audit methodology, is really the nuts and bolts of how do I go about registering with SQFI. How do I, what do the audits look like? How many stages are there? What's the audit duration look like? What's the scoring mechanism look like? What are the definitions of nonconformities or nonconformances? What do I have to do about those? How do I move from one level to another? All of that is captured in the audit methodology in Section A. Section B of Appendix 3 gives you some considerations on how to use the SQFI ethical sourcing certification mark, which you can see in the bottom right-hand side of the slide. And it also provides a nice glossary of terms and definitions that you'll see throughout the other documents in the standard. And lastly, Appendix 4 talks about auditor competence and registration. Key area. Not that any of the others are not key, but someone is going to come in and visit your facility and make inferences based on their sample. They'll look at documents. They will look at your practices and your conditions in your facilities. They will interview employees at various levels of the organization. and make decisions. And it's really important to make sure that those folks have good background, good experience in the levels that are in the standard, or I'm sorry, the topical areas that are in the standard, and also to provide some consistency. So there are training opportunities that SQFI has made available for trainers, and we'll cover some of that in just a few minutes. Okay. So I bridged ahead a little bit as I went through a couple of slides ago, but I just want to come back to, in the standard, there are 6 elements, 4.1 through 4.6, and they span across 24 sub-elements. And you can see them listed out in 4.1. I already talked about each one of those areas. I sheepishly said that in the supplier and subcontractor section, there are only 3 requirements. They do sound easy, but obviously over time they are not. Section 3, again, 4.3, discrimination, harassment, and abuse, wage compliance, working hours, fair labor practices, terms of employment, benefits, all of those kinds of considerations are included in the social management programs. 4.4 I bundled together. We actually, out of the original standard, pulled safety and health out to give it more emphasis and bundled it with environmental. And you can see that for 1 and 2 there are developing a plan. That plan involves making sure that you have done your risk assessment, prioritized your risks, identified, do I have control measures in place? If so, how effectively are they operating? Do I need additional controls? And start that process, which again is very similar to the HACCP thought process. Regulatory compliance comes into effect here, as it does in the food code, where you're talking more FDA compliance. Here you will be talking employment-related regulations, wage-related regulations, Anti-Discrimination, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Taft-Hartley Act dealing with labor unions, et cetera. All of those kinds of considerations and regulations can come into play. Certainly the body of OSHA regulations, or if you're in Canada or Mexico, and national, provincial, state regulations in those countries. And making sure you're in compliance as a base. There's nothing to stop you from going beyond, but certainly as a minimum, particularly in level 1 of the assessment requirements or certification requirements, that meeting existing regulations is very important. Equipment maintenance, I broached earlier, and there are certain key pieces of equipment on your facility, whether that be instrumentation, measurement, before I could discharge water, before I could emit. Some of you have air permits, some of you have water permits, some of you have permits in other areas. So it's not only, there are certainly some FDA requirements that come into play. It could be banned and restricted substances lists that some of your customers may have and ask you to comply with. So all of those can come into play in 4.3 and 4.4. And then lastly, making sure that you're prepared to manage incidents. I used to work for a company that made insecticides and herbicides, and certainly there were worker protection standards, there were FIFRA regulations, there were labels that talked about particular crops that were approved, and application rates and application methods, and folks don't always follow them. So things do happen. Sometimes there's off-target applications, sometimes there's spills, leaks, sometimes there's fires, sometimes there are injuries and illnesses. When things go bump in the night, making sure that your organizations have thought about that in advance and are prepared to handle that given the resources you have to work with, or if you cannot resource that internally, that you have an external resource identified to help you in those kind of considerations. If you think about many of the major headlines of incidents that occur, oftentimes they get to that point because folks did not plan ahead of time, and therefore the impact, whether it's on employees, the environment, a community, a food group, et cetera, has gotten out of hand, and it gets lots of visibility. So the more preparation, the better response. I mentioned in 4.5 internal audits, monitoring, investigating employee concerns, taking appropriate corrective and preventive action, not always thinking about being reactive, but thinking how can we prevent these types of incidents from occurring, keeping good records to substantiate not only for an auditor, but also for regulators, NGOs, anybody in the process that has questions about your programs, processes, policies, and practices. And then the management review process, which is key to do that with enough regularity that management is keeping its pulse on the process and making sure that they're driving continual improvement. Lastly, 4.6, having a systematic approach, whether that's a balanced scorecard, whether it's a mutually beneficial supplier relationship. There are a number of different types of techniques that are mentioned in the standard and derived from ISO 10014. And what senior management actions specifically have been selected and what actions are being taken to help implement that approach. So those are the nuts and bolts of the standard itself. We come to Appendix 1. And you can see the title is Certification Assessment Requirements. These are across three levels. These are the requirements that an auditor would be auditing to. The standard provides the overall umbrella of requirements. The specific requirements are included in Appendix 1. And you can see there's 13 here where there were only 6 elements in the standard, and I want to point out why that's the case. In Section 3.0, for example, ethical sourcing objectives, targets, and management programs, with a nice acronym OTMPs. These objectives, targets, and management programs are required in multiple sections of the standard. In particular here, 5.0 related to suppliers, 6.0 related to management, social management, 7 related to environment, 8 related to health and safety, etc. Rather than taking all of those requirements for objectives and targets and adding them to each of those individual areas, which would make the governing documents much larger, we elected to bundle them in Section 3.0. The same for Section 9, recognition of and compliance with ethical sourcing related legal and other requirements. Legal requirements are pretty well understood. Other requirements could be trade association requirements, customer-specific requirements, sourcing organization requirements, etc. that may not be legalities, but certainly are required for you to do business with particular customers or organizations. Again, we could put those where they apply under Sections 4 through 8 or bundle them. So we elected to bundle, and that's why some of these grew a little bit. And you can see that generally there's very good alignment, though, between the requirements here and the standard. So I want to give you a little bit of information on the 3 certification levels. And from here on, talk a little bit about some of the similarities with and some of the contrasts with the SQF Food Code. There are 3 levels. That's very similar to the Food Code. However, the 3 levels are somewhat different. Level 1 is an entry level. It is a certified level. It's not a self-assessment. It is a third-party or independent assessment. And it really focuses on required practices from social, environmental, OH&S management, supply chain management, to identify and comply with applicable regulations and start putting foundational practices in place to understand your impact on the environment, health and safety, et cetera, and make sure you have fundamental controls in place. Level 2 is recognizes organizations that have implemented the foundational criteria in Level 1, but are starting to progress to a more advanced ethical sourcing management system. There are more stringent requirements. The focus is more, starts to go more externally versus only internal. And it might also include some international convention considerations that were not in Level 1. Level 3 recognizes organizations really that have leading practices in place. It certainly is a step change from level 1 and 2, where there's more focus on legal requirements. In level 3, there's much more focus on international conventions and ideological type considerations, more so where level 1 and 2 look at more fundamental practical considerations. Okay. And here's an example. I mentioned section 3.0, objectives, targets, and programs. You can see that title across the top banner. And then you see a reference, and I've referenced section 4.1 through section 4.6. There are some sections that reference very specifically back to section 4.2 in the standard, for example. There are some of the bundled elements, as I discussed, that reference across multiple sections of the standard. So I tried to put a link there to help folks move freely back and forth between the documents. You can see on the left-hand column, in this case, I just included requirement 3.1. And I could have phrased this, the organization shall establish, document, et cetera, but we put it more in an inquisitive or question format for auditors. As the organization established, documented, and implemented processes and programs to achieve established objectives and targets. And you can see down below that these all deal with ethical sourcing. So the term ethical sourcing related includes health, safety, and environmental and social topics. It doesn't exclude any of those 4 major areas. Level 1, the organization has established and documented those types of objectives, targets, and programs for appropriate functions and levels within the organization. It might be that it's a departmental level. It might be that it needs to be at an entire facility level. So whatever is appropriate has been taken into consideration. And you can see below that the focus is on operations, activities, et cetera, that impact more at the site level. So looking inward first and then broaching or spanning outward. Level 2, the focus has been expanded to consider how your site influences and interacts with the local environment and community beyond your physical boundaries, certainly beyond the scope of your activities. This is for a company that has a brick and mortar facility, say a processing facility. This thought process works very well. It can also work for grower opportunities and also for other levels of the supply chain. And level 3 then starts to give more influence for considerations outside of the local community and more broadly, more globally. So it goes more from local to regional, let's say, to national and international across the 3 levels. I mentioned the contents of level or appendix 2, so you can see why do we need a guide, what is responsible social practice, what is responsible environmental practice, and in this guide, health and safety is bundled in with responsible social practice. And then section 4 provides the sourcing, ethical sourcing management system requirements given implementation and auditing guidance, as I mentioned earlier. And I'll give you another example of that in just a second. And then it has 4 annexes, and I think it's important to point those out at this point. Annex 1 talks about social issues in the agri-food industry. Now, our thought process with the ethical sourcing standard is that it certainly has potential application in any industry sector, not just in the agri-food industry. But the thinking was that SQFI does service this industry. The initial interest likely would be in this industry. So this hasn't been broadened, but it will be in a future version. So it talks about social industries in the agri-food industry in 1.0, and then in 2.0 provides you with a risk assessment toolkit. If you may already have a risk assessment mechanism in your organization. If you don't, certainly here is one that you can use. And it broaches, the main topic is to help you with prioritizing, not only identifying, but prioritizing and evaluating the effectiveness and efficiency of your controls that you currently have in place. Annex 3 does the same process except for environmental issues, and Annex 4, same risk assessment toolkit with considerations around environmental topics. And here's what the sections in that appendix would look like. You can see in green the implementation guidance. What does it mean? So that gives you some interpretations of what the element requires, some definitions of the terms used there. What do I have to do? Gives you suggestions and examples. The intent was to not be extremely prescriptive, to give you the parameters, if you will. There are a lot of ways within those parameters, a lot of processes that you might have in place that satisfy the requirements, so it can span across various types of industries, various types of food sectors, et cetera. But generally, what are some examples of good practices that an auditor would be looking for? And then again, auditing guidance. This section provides general suggestions of what an auditor will be looking for when they look at the conformance or conformity with the standard, including the types of documents, et cetera, that might be looked at. And you can see another link at the bottom there where the arrow is. Specific criteria from Appendix 1 certification assessment requirements are referenced following this symbol. So where this requirement refers you back to Appendix 1 would be given to you right there, so easily you can go back and forth between Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. Appendix 3, audit methodology, again, how to register with SQFI, how to select the level, how to move through levels, talks about the initial certification process, including audits, talks about surveillance audits. Surveillance in this context of ISO 17021 accreditation has a completely different connotation than 17065 and the SQF food code. So I'll cover that with you in just a few minutes. Talks about auditing resources, identification. So what's the audit duration? What's it based on? And all of that is in the certification, the audit methodology. And then lastly, obligations of certification bodies and organizations who are pursuing certification, or perhaps that should be more correctly stated, registration. How does a CB go about registering with SQFI again, and then what are the obligations of those bodies? Part B has the ethical sourcing logo, how to use it appropriately, and there would also be on your certificate not only the SQF logo, there would be an ANAB logo or mark because it is accredited by ANAB, and there would also be the logo of your certification body, whether that's Equal Certification Group, Silicor, or whatever other CB that you're using. And then lastly, in Part C, a nice glossary of definitions and terms for it. Okay, so there's a lot in Appendix 3. I wanted to pull out a few of these and help compare and contrast a little bit with the food code in this slide. There are 3 certification levels. Again, Level 1 is awareness, compliance, and fundamental control. Level 2, more proactive management and performance improvement. Level 3, leading practice. There are 3 levels, again, in the SQF food code. At least one level is self-assessment, and there are some differences in how you restrictions or opportunities to level up. So let me just cover one key area. We would hope that organizations that implement the process would start with level 1. I think that's a given recommendation, although we do have one company that chose level 2 and was successful. We also have another company that chose level 2 and was not successful. To level up, the requirement is, let me jump down to the score just a second in the next to last bullet. You start with 100 points, just like you do with the food code. A critical nonconformity is 50 points, is pretty much stop the presses. I would, as an auditor, call my certification body, my certification manager, discuss that, and then there would be a discussion with the client to determine what the next steps are. But you could not pass the audit with a critical nonconformity because it's valued at 50 points. That puts you below the greater than or equal to 70 to pass the certification audit. You would also be required to address all nonconformities that were identified during the audit. Okay? So if I'm at level 1 and I do that, I become accredited to level 1. We start to implement everything. We feel that our level 1 is pretty robust. We'd like to shoot for level 2. You can do that. The certification cycle, as opposed to the food code, is 3 years with intervening surveillance audits. I'll come back to that in a second. But if you choose to level up, you don't have to wait till the end of the 3 years. You could do it when you're ready. It would require, the full context of the certification audit. And if you're moving to level 2, for example, you would have to satisfy all of the requirements at level 1, 100%, and then achieve at least 70 at level 2 and address any nonconformities that were identified during the level 2 assessment. When you move to level 3, you'd have to have a 100% score on level 1 and level 2 and achieve at least 70 on level 3. No penalty if you decide you'd like to shoot for level 2, as long as you maintain 70 or above for level 1 and you address any nonconformities that are found, you would still retain your level 1 certification. There are stage 1 and stage 2 audits. In the food code, it's the desk audit and the on-site audit. We looked at doing that, but 17021 has a requirement at least some portion of stage 1, especially for the initial certification audit, has to be done on-site. So in order to help reduce costs a bit, there's a portion of that that can look like a desk audit, can be the document review portion, but then you still need, the auditor still has to visit your site, determine that the structure is in place, the elements, you are ready and prepared to move to the stage 2 audit. And the stage 2 would be completely on-site. That varies a little bit. There's some base time or audit duration that's applied, and then there's also some additional some additions that can be included based on the size of the facility in terms of square footage, et cetera, acreage, et cetera, and the number of employees can come into play. Very similar. That was based with a combination of the food code requirements and on the 17021 requirements. And then finally, the 3-year certification cycle I mentioned earlier. Surveillance audits in the ISO 17021 world for environmental management systems, occupational health and safety, et cetera, the progression is you have your initial registration assessment. After year 1, you have, and within year 1, no later than 1 year after you get your certification, you have a surveillance audit. The surveillance audit is intended to make sure that things are functioning as they were when you passed the registration assessment. There are some key elements in the standard that drive continual improvement. Just some quick ones are things like your internal audits, your corrective preventive actions, your objectives, targets, and programs, your management review. Those are, and others are elements that would be looked at every time that an audit occurs. And there are some that would be mixed and matched a little between the surveillance audits. So you would have a surveillance audit year 1 after your registration assessment. Year 2, another surveillance audit. Year 3, you would have a recertification audit where all of the elements, again, would be looked at. So a little bit different connotation from surveillance audit in the food code. Okay. Here is a flow chart of the process for organizations to certify. We'll learn about the ethical sourcing standard in the appendices. You can do that by going to the URL that's shown at the bottom of the slide. Register on the SQF ES website. Sarah is going to cover that a little later in the program. Designate an ethical sourcing management rep and team. Identify the certification level that you want to shoot for. appropriately document and implement your program based on the requirements of the level that you're selected, and then select your certification body. You may do that certainly a little bit earlier in the process, but that has to be done. And get the audit scheduled. I know audits, oftentimes companies start at the first part of the year and they want to have their certification audit at the end of the year. And so for auditors, it's a pretty busy time of year when that happens. So if you have a time that you want to have your audit that's other than the last quarter of the year, would probably be easier for you to schedule, just as a note on scheduling. Okay. And then Appendix 4, what are some of the nuts and bolts there? Okay, there are education and training requirements and work and auditing experience requirements for auditors. There are some key competencies that are based in the ISO documents. Some general competencies about conducting management system audits, opening meetings, closing meetings, some structure, how to go about interviewing, how to interact with, client employees. It's not an I gotcha. It should be a positive experience. It should be very transparent. It's intended to help you drive internal continual improvement. Auditors should hopefully be a member of your continual improvement team in that aspect and bringing up opportunities for you to address, if they're there. Certainly there's positive findings, if nothing else. And then the auditor registration and re-registration, applying for registration through SQF, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Application processing that's done by Exemplar Global. They make the decision. We right now have, if I recall correctly, 7 or 8 approved auditors spanning across the several certification bodies that are already in the process. There is an appeals process if the decision is not in favor of approving the auditor. There is a complaint process against auditors that can be brought by client locations. And then there are re-registration requirements. So let me dive into some of the specific requirements. So you see 2.1 at the top left, education. We're looking for a 2-year degree in a field related to ethical sourcing. That could be environmental management. It could be occupational health and safety. It could be human resources. It could be food science, et cetera. Looking that folks have some understanding and familiarity with the various topics that are in the standard. And you would have to, in your application that goes to SQF and will be reviewed by Exemplar Global, you would be required to provide the types of evidence. I won't spend much time over there. I'd like to spend more time on the first 2 columns. So training, successful completion of the following training programs, a lead auditor training program. There is an SQF ethical sourcing program training that's for auditors. That's not intended to be a lead auditor training program. It's more the nuts and bolts of the standard regulations that apply that an auditor would most likely see when they're in the field, and some other techniques, but it's not intended to be a lead auditor training program. The expectation is folks who attend the ethical sourcing auditor training program would already bring that. A number of CBs offer that. SQFI offers that. There are a number of organizations that offer that lead auditor training program. And that's typically, in my experience, about a 4.5 to 5 day process. And there is a completion certificate of completion if you pass the examination, certificate of attendance if you don't. So we are requiring that certificate of completion. Work experience, 5 years work experience in the same type of topical areas: environmental management, quality management, food safety management, occupational health and safety management, et cetera. 5 years experience in the field, and 160 hours, 20 audit days within the past 7 years. That's not a lot, but it does demonstrate, it does demonstrate that you have experience. 4.1, 2 sponsors required. And there is a form, pardon me just a second. There is a requirement to have 2 folks. There's a form for the sponsors to fill out that all has to be a part of the package. All of the evidence that's listed in the right-hand column is required to be in your application package. And then auditors are required to personally declare that they will comply with the SQFI ES Code of Conduct, which is very similar to the SQF Food Code of Conduct. And every 3 years, submit evidence of audit experience, professional development, professional updates, etc., very similar to the SQF Food Code requirement, but can span across some other topical areas that are covered by the ethical sourcing standard that may not be necessarily in the ethical or in the food service code. I apologize for my voice. Here is another flow chart. Talks about certification process for auditors. Again, request the application form from SQFI. You see the email address there where you can request it. Gather the required evidence that's indicated in Appendix 4. Let me jump back real quickly. All of the documents that I've been talking about are also on the SQFIethicalsourcing.com website. So you can pick those up there, and it will give you more detail. Submit your application along with the required fee. Receive approval notice from Exemplar Global. If you're not approved, there is the appeal process. A list of approved certification bodies is shown on the website. And since there's not a list of auditors per se, those auditors work with or for the CBs. So you could contact your CB or any appropriate CB and ask them about approved auditors, and then re-register every 3 years as required, meeting the requirements for auditing, meeting the requirements for professional development. Just a few more wrap-up slides. This is a copy of the website opening screen. You can see the pumpkins there. That part changes a little bit, but generally the rest of it is stationary, and you can see that it includes topics, and this is where you can get the documents, why become certified, how to get started, resources, etc. And Sarah's going to cover some more of this with you in a few minutes. There's the URL again at the bottom for you to access the site. There is an audit tool that's been developed. You can see the first couple of sections here. It talks a little bit about the company information, and then the second section talks about certification body information. Okay, that's the lead-in. The nuts and bolts of this really are in this next slide, though. And I just picked out section 1.0 on scope. There's really only one requirement for scope, that you identify the scope of your management system in terms of your processes, facilities that are included, the physical boundaries, and identify the level that you're going to pursue certification to, and keep all this information current. That spans across all 3 levels. If there are specific requirements at each level, more similar to the example I showed you earlier for Appendix 1, those will be delineated down, and then a decision is made by the auditor. A response is needed for all nonconformities or other observations that are important to capture. This could be opportunities for improvement in addition to nonconformities or just important topics. You can see that there is an evidence column on the right. So if I look at specific documents, I can put that information there. There's also a scope sectional evidence. For instance, what I might use that section for would be to what you shared with me during an audit on the boundaries and the level, and et cetera. I would capture all of that information there so we can keep track of it. And I would make a determination on from the drop-down whether it's a minor, a major, et cetera, a critical nonconformity, whether it's an opportunity for improvement, whether you might be exempt. That's not going to happen very frequently, but it could happen that you're exempt from a requirement. Or it could be that it doesn't apply because you don't have that specific piece of equipment or specific type of process, et cetera, in place right now. Doesn't mean you would be exempt from it, because if you had it, it would apply. It just means currently it doesn't apply. Some things that are in the offing, Bob's already mentioned a few considerations earlier. There are additional auditor training offerings, currently March and October, I believe, of next year. Sarah will confirm that for me, I hope, in a few minutes. And those will, I believe, they're going to be held in the Dayton, Ohio area. And then to determine the need for any additional tools. As we move through the process, sourcing and supplier organizations will interact with auditors, will interact with SQF folks. There's certainly hope, and with certification bodies interaction, that there might be other tools that would be helpful to have on the website. If so, and they'll be considered and added as appropriate. So that's an ongoing continual improvement, hopefully, from our standpoint. There are some questions that have come up. There will be a question and answer section as we move forward on the website also, which can answer perhaps a number of questions and save phone calls from. But if not, folks will be happy to answer your phone calls there. Okay. So at this point, I think I've talked with you enough. I'm going to turn back to Sarah, and she'll cover some of these considerations. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, just to confirm, we will be having 2 ethical sourcing auditor trainings in 2016. We might add another one depending on availability of the facility and Steve's availability. But those 2 will be in March and October in the great city of Dayton, Ohio. Go Dayton Flyers. And you can find all the resources for that available on our website under the Events tab. Now I'm going to tell you why you need the SQFI Ethical Sourcing Certification. Buyers, suppliers, and subcontractors from all industries work hard to establish a healthy and positive brand and image about the products and the company they buy, sell, and represent. By adopting the ethical sourcing standard, buyers appeal to the growing consumer base demanding increased social responsibility and a reduced environmental footprint. Suppliers boast documentation providing a high level of commitment to ethical business practices that outshines competitors. The subcontractors reduce the odds of a negative impact to a supplier's reputation. The SQFI Ethical Sourcing Certification provides brand protection because it appeals to the emotional side of your customer and communicates to them you care about the working conditions of laborers and the effects your business has on the environment. One of the biggest explanations for consumer spending and their decision-making habits is emotions. Given the choice to buy a product that was made with considerations around ethics and responsibility versus a product that was not made with those considerations in mind, consumers are more likely to buy the product that was made with ethics and responsibility in mind. It makes the consumer feel better about how they are spending their money and makes them feel like they are participating in something for the greater good of society and the environment. And we all know that when the consumer feels better about the products they are buying, they're more likely to buy more, creating a higher demand for the product. The consumer also becomes loyal to where they are buying these products from and will likely keep buying products from them. If you are a retailer who is known for only using suppliers that takes ethics and social responsibility into consideration, your customer will begin to form a more emotional relationship with you that leads to loyalty for your brand and the trust in the products you're placing on your shelves. When consumers are happy, then buyers and retailers are happy. And when buyers and retailers are happy, this means more product demand from the suppliers, making them happy. Buyers will want to start using only suppliers who can demonstrate their products and have made socially and environmentally ethical, and obtaining the SQFI ethical sourcing certification is that proof, giving the supplier an advantage over their competitor. Because the SQFI ethical sourcing standard is an independent third-party assessment, there is no fines or punitive measures like there would be associated with an audit by a government entity. Preparing for the ethical sourcing audit and collecting the proper resources allows you to get your facility ready for an EPA and or an OSHA audit. It also allows you to correct and fix any gaps in your program that would have cost you money or additional resources had a government agency found it. And because the standard encompasses both environmental and occupational health and safety assessment, this saves your company time, money, and personnel so you can focus on your business and your customer. Now, Steve is going to talk about some of the other benefits of implementation.
Thank you, Sarah. I mentioned earlier in various sections that the activity of identifying, prioritizing, and managing risk is an extremely important activity. I know that you folks on the line have been involved with doing that type thing in your, for your products. You've done HACCP evaluations, et cetera, so you understand the importance. When it comes to ethical sourcing, we're broaching that a little bit broader. It encompasses the social management considerations. It certainly looks at supply. There are supplier requirements in the food code, and this expands on them into the ethical sourcing areas for the ethical sourcing code. Environmental health and safety, some of the emotional areas, if you will, that Sarah just mentioned, and making sure that there are corrective and preventive measures in place. I know that oftentimes, instances do happen, situations do occur, and I believe that the public looks at a company and takes a look at whether or not your organization is prepared to deal with the situation. Have you thought about this ahead of time? Have you thought about the potential impact, whether it's on a family level, whether it's a community level, et cetera? Have you thought about that, and have you put appropriate measures in place? The better that you're prepared, I believe the more favorably that the general public reacts to you. And the scope of the organization that has to deal with an emergency is certainly reduced. Emergencies can become crises. The better preparation that your organization has, the better prepared you are to help prevent a crisis from occurring. If you have a crisis, you're certainly, your management will find that they'll spend more time managing the crisis than they will managing their business. So there are certainly good reasons, not only from a social standpoint to do this, but certainly from a health and safety and environmental consideration standpoint also. Possible cost reductions. There's some hard dollars that can be gained. I know folks who implement an environmental management system, they start looking at those objectives, targets, and programs. They start looking at opportunities like energy reduction, waste reduction, the kind of end of the pipe thinking, where can I, or perhaps recycle, But over time, they start thinking more toward the front part of the pipe from, let's say, from an environmental standpoint. How can I prevent pollution from occurring in the first part? How can I reduce packaging waste? How can I take more proactive steps? And typically, those also provide very hard dollar benefits to an organization. And then there's the soft dollars, improved efficiency. Things are documented more appropriately. The organizational transfer of knowledge is enhanced. The public image can be enhanced in the goodwill that goes along with a more favorable public image. All of those are soft dollars, but they're real. It can aid in liability reductions. Sarah's slide talked about in potential EPA, OSHA type considerations, and there could be other agencies involved also, reducing the potential impact of citations and the dollar penalties. OSHA in the United States, for example, just approved or was able to get approved an increased multiplication for things like repeat violations or willful violations that can start looking at $126,000 for one offense or one non-compliance, if you will. So from a legal and regulatory standpoint, certainly it can improve, and the better prepared you are, again, the less food or less fodder, I should say, for defense attorneys. Can provide some benefits from a legality standpoint. If you had a duty to warn or a duty to take action and you haven't, then potentially you're often more liable. And some potential differentiation of business opportunities. Sarah mentioned public image and satisfying customer requirements. These are very real. I'm sure you folks understand that more so than I do. And when those benefits accrue to you, then that's a much more favorable business environment than the opposite. And in my last bullet, one reason why I'm a big proponent of management systems is they outlast individuals. Sometimes you have a very strong individual. It could be a strong plant manager. It could be a strong SQF practitioner. It could be a strong EHS manager. And your company is doing good things, and they leave, and there's a void. And that void sometimes is created because there's not a system in place that continues to purr without someone necessarily leading that effort. Now, if the vacancy stays open too long, certainly things can still start to unravel, but over time, management systems help you to have mechanisms, techniques, processes, procedures in place that can outlast individuals. And I think that's a very important benefit, and hopefully one that you folks appreciate. Again, I point you to the Ethical Sourcing Certification logo that's on this next page, and the address, info@sqfi.com, is an area where you can find, or where you would submit information related to auditor certification, auditor approval, and then the sqfiethicalsourcing.com URL where you can find documents and other information that we've discussed. Sarah, back to you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Now we're going to hear from Dennis Lankum, who is the Environmental Manager at Muskow Family Olive Companies. I wanted to let you know that Muskow was the first company to receive the SQFI Ethical Sourcing Level 2 certification. They worked very hard with their program, and they've been visited by Walmart and other retailers and suppliers who are interested to see how this program works. Dennis is going to talk about a supplier's perspective and why their company decided to obtain the certification and how it's changed their company and processes for the better. Dennis?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for the introduction, and I think I just wanted to share with you a little bit about our journey, why we pursued ethical sourcing, what it means to us, and I guess ultimately what we hope it also means to our customers. Before I go down that, though, just a little bit of background. Our company is Muskow Family Olive Company. We're a third-generation family-owned company in operation for about 70 years. Our core business is processing and canning black ripe olives. So it's the olives that everybody likes to stick on their fingers. But we do have a secondary facility up in Northern California that does some of the Sicilian green-style olives as well. When all is said and done, we do roughly half the national market share for black ripe olives. So I've been with the company since since 2002, and I think like most environmental programs probably, it all began just kind of picking the low-hanging fruit, and there was a lot of it. Measuring everything that we wanted to manage, decreasing uses of different natural resources, where we could and where it took little to no capital requirement to do that. And at the end of the day, we were able to do a lot of good, make reductions all over the place, but also at the end of the day, it kind of resulted in a whole bunch of separate, scattered environmental programs that covered a lot of the traditional environmental hotspots like air emissions and natural gas and electricity use, water use, things like that. Didn't really touch on any of the social management issues, and safety was kind of its own program doing its own thing. So we also give regular customer tours as part of our normal business practice and sales and marketing department. And we would always take customers out kind of around the facility. We have about 300 acres out here, and show them all the things and all the good that we were doing. A lot of it is very visible and tangible, and you can see that. But still, it seemed really fragmented and not very, very cohesive. Also, around this time, we were starting to receive different questionnaires from some of our customers. So these questionnaires would ask you to fill out what you're doing, what are you doing to address environmental impacts with water, with air emissions. Some of them touched on the social compliance issues, and none of them were a standard form or kind of a unified standard format. And so it got to be really cumbersome, answering one questionnaire for one customer and then somebody else asking kind of the same things but in a little different format somewhere else. And also, the last thing to say about the same time frame, which is around 2009, 2010, is that there were ethical issues in other sectors and safety issues outside of food processing that were bringing risk to our attention, and we kind of just started to get this feeling that there was something missing from what we're doing, and that needed to be included in any next steps that we took. And so ethical sourcing really turned out to be the perfect solution because it provided a structure to wrap all of our scattered programs into, and it unified safety into that. And it also allowed us to take kind of the next step in our journey and begin managing and interacting with our supply chain. And so to do all of that, we implemented kind of the ethical sourcing version 1.0, which preceded everything we've been talking about today. And that version 1.0 gave us the bones and the structure to accomplish everything that we were just talking about, managing and interacting with the supply chain, wrapping all these programs up into a neat package, whereas before they were just very fragmented and very scattered, not very organized. Then we achieved certification under ethical sourcing version 1.0, and we recertified that, re-audited that for, I think, 4 years total. And then as we were kind of looking down the road to our 2015 audit this year, we became aware of the option to audit under this new version 2.0 code. and we didn't really know what to do. So our environmental team scheduled a meeting with the executive team here at Musco, and we presented our options, and we said, listen, here we can audit against the old code, version 1.0, or we can audit against the new code, version 2.0. And if we decide to go version 2.0, we have another decision to make, which is what level do we want to try and achieve, 1, 2, or 3. And Felix Musco, our CEO, he answered perfectly, and he said, guys, what I'd like you to do is make the decision to pursue the level that makes us grow the most as a company in this area of environmental and social awareness and management. And so it was pretty clear what we were needing to do, and that was to pursue ethical sourcing level 2. We didn't have time to do a full evaluation and a gap analysis between 1, 2, and 3, decide if we wanted to pursue 3. We knew that level 2 was definitely going to cause us as a company to grow, and so given the timing and the time frame, we decided to pursue number 2. So this timeline we have up was we got CEO approval in January of 2015, and then implementation, and it's a shame to reduce that time in our company to just one word, implementation, from January to May 2015, because really that sent our whole entire company into a panic. This program was so far-reaching and so comprehensive that we had IT support develop web-based structure and support for some of the new programs. Our purchasing department was reinvented to a point, and that required new workflows. Also, our accounts payable department was touched with this because of the purchasing aspect. And also, there were some additional documentation that our safety department had to come up with in order to meet all the requirements of this. And so it was a big, just all around company push for about five months. And we had our third-party audit in June, and we were just very pleased that all the effort and all the effort that went into upgrading our system and bringing it into compliance with the level 2 standard really paid off, and that we were rewarded with that, the level 2 certification, and also just honored to be the first ones in the world to be able to do that. And so since then, we have had lots of growing pains, I think you could say. As any change does have growing pains in a company, we are improving and upgrading and continually developing these systems as we've worked out some of the kinks in the web support systems that our IT department built. But at the end of the day, it has driven sustainability and this ethical sourcing concept of continual improvement just deeper and deeper into our company culture, just by the fact that it touched so many people in our company. And so, now we're continuing to do our customer tours. All of our customer communications include just a brief overview of ethical sourcing, the 2.0 program. And what we're trying to do is really communicate to them the added value of that brand protection and risk management that our can of olives can offer to all of our downstream customers. And it's really exciting. We're really happy to be a part of this, and just really looking forward to seeing where this goes in the next few years, and what continual adoption of this program will do to it. So just thank you for the time to share, and Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dennis. So now I'm going to tell you about getting started with ethical sourcing certification. So now that you've heard what the SQFI ethical sourcing standard is and why you need it, I'm going to tell you how to start on the road to obtaining this important certification. First, I'd invite you to download a copy of the ethical sourcing standard on our ethical sourcing website. You can see there the URL. Once you have read the standard, you can register for the database, and below there's a screenshot of the database, the registration page. Site registration, we have an annual fee with SQFI, and that's $250 USDs for 1 year. And then what I'd ask you to do is to obtain proposals from ethical sourcing licensed certification bodies. And so right now we have 3 official certification bodies that are licensed: Eagle Certification Group, Perry Johnson, and Mary New NutriSciences, which was formerly Silicar. Currently there are 3 other certification bodies that are working on their licensing agreements with us, and those companies are SCS, BV, and ProCert. And once you contact one of those certification bodies to obtain quotes and details on the ethical sourcing certification, then what you would do is talk to them about scheduling an audit, and then coming out and doing the initial certification audit, which would encompass the document review and your facility assessment. Before we take some question and answers, I also want to just let you know that as we build more resources for our program and get more certification bodies and auditors involved in this, check back on our website for events that are upcoming in 2016, such as our free learning lunch webinars, just like we have with SQFI, which would be on topics such as how to successfully implement and prepare you for the ethical sourcing program, as well as information days, which are one-day workshops on the ABCs and how to get started with our ethical sourcing program. We also do those for SQF as well. Again, our website is a great resource. All the documents on there are free to download and are available for you to use. And well, if anyone has any questions, if we want to type them in the chat box, or Steve, if you have any questions that you would like to answer over the air.
Hi, yes, I do. Okay, there was a question that came up last week's international conference, excuse me, and some of these are really valuable, I think, for the group that's on this call to understand. So let me just start there. One of the questions was, can the audit be done along with SQF audit? And I think the answer there is that there's no final answer right now. And the reason being that you're looking for a background and experience of folks. And the question would be whether you have an auditor who has both food sector experience and the other topical areas covered by ethical sourcing, and whether or not they would be approved as an auditor. And there's at least one auditor right now who is approved that has both those backgrounds in their repertoire, but I'm not sure how many others. And then also, there's two different standards that come into play with the accreditation, 17065, 17021, and those are managed really by the certification bodies. So it would be somewhat of a certification body question to make sure that they have those types of skills and auditors that are approved in according to the requirements of ethical sourcing. So I'm not sure that I could give you a definitive answer right now. There's some caveats that have to be put into place, but that certainly is a question that is being actively, the answer is being actively pursued at this point. So stay tuned, please, for that. There was a question on what are the specific requirements for auditor experience. We covered those, and what I would like at least to broach with you is that if you feel that you are experienced, have those areas in your background, please apply for certification. Don't necessarily cut yourself out. One of the questions was, do I have to have management experience? No. Do I have to have been an SQF practitioner? No, not necessarily. So there are certainly requirements in the standard. They are in Appendix 4, and they're also on the slides that will be available to you from this session. But take a look at that. If you have management system experience, you have experience in those areas, you feel you meet the requirements, please apply. Don't hold off. Okay? There was a question about when will the new ethical sourcing code come out and guidance along with that. I think we put that to bed that the code is out and it's available on the website. Is there a symbol on your package when you pass the audit, and how does it compare to the free trade symbol? The symbol that you would receive a certificate, that certificate would certainly have the logo of your certification body. It would have the logo of ANAB because it's an ANAB accredited standard, and it would have the SQFI ethical sourcing logo on it. So I'm not sure how, to be honest with you, that compares to free trade symbol, and it's not typically necessarily intended to be on a package because it says that your management system is accredited. It's not a product-related accreditation like the food code may be, so different flavor. So please make sure that when we come out as auditors, we would look to make sure that those marks are being used appropriately. So it's not an implication or not an indication that your product has been certified to this code. It's your management system. Is there a logo that represents ethical sourcing? We just covered that. And is there a requirement for a designated practitioner per se? No, there is a requirement that a senior management level person be designated with overall responsibility. In some organizations, that has been a corporate EHS type person. Others, it's more managed from an HR standpoint or that type of thing. So it depends on your organizational structure. And then there will likely be, certainly have to be, I think, team members that are responsible for the various components of the standard, but no specific requirement for a practitioner like the SQF code. Okay. How long does it take? I'm working off this slide, the questions that are from this session. How long does it take to complete the SQF ethical sourcing program training? That is 2 days, 2 full days, and then finishes no later than 2 o'clock on the 3rd day. Working to try to get that to 2.5, but right now it's essentially 2 3/4 days. Okay. Sorry, I'm ferreting through all of this. Sorry, I can't hear you. Go Buckeyes. I like that comment. Are there any other questions from the group? I don't see very many at the bottom here.
Yeah, if you look in the chat window, I think there are a few questions.
I'm down there. I'm scrolling through these.
I can read them to you then. Please describe the required audit duration in each level based on factory size or number of employees, or do you treat each facility under level 3, then score them against lower levels?
No, I would have to open, I don't have those documents open in front of me, but perhaps someone else could take a question and I'll pull that up and I'll come back and give you a better feel. Can we do that?
Sure, Steve. We had a question regarding if NSF, one of our SQF license certification bodies, was licensed to under the ethical sourcing certification. And right now, that answer is no. They did, if they quoted you as part of your SQF audit, that was our old standard. It was version 1. This is version 2, and it's completely different. It's new. So we're having it's accredited, and it's being benchmarked to the Global Social Compliance Initiative. So it's a completely different program. That's why we are requiring our certification bodies to become licensed under this as well. Hence why we are then also having auditor trainings to train the auditors to audit specifically against this as well.
Okay, I'm ready to answer the question. I would refer the person who asked the question to Appendix 3, page 10, but in a nutshell, the requirements for Stage 1 for level 1, 2, and 3 respectively are 1 day, 1.5 days, 2 days. That's for the Stage 1 audit. And for the Stage 2 audits, the basic duration would be, again, respectively, 1, 1.5, and 2 days, with a potential additional days based on number of employees that ranges from 200 and below would be 0 additional days, and from 201 up to large, greater than 4,000, the additional days range from 1/2 day up to 3 days. So let's say you had a 4,000 employee operation, and you're looking for a level 3, I believe was the question. Let me take level 2 since it's in the middle. Would be 1.5 days basic, would be 2.5 days for the number of employees, so that's 4 days, and then the additional amount up to 200,000 square feet would be no addition, and at 200,000 it starts to go from 0.5 days up to 2 days. So if you had a facility that was being measured in up to 500,000 square feet, it would be an additional day. And part of that is just because the auditor has to cover more ground, and the tour takes longer, and reaching out to interviews at remote parts of your facility all that takes a little longer. So again, if you had a size of your facility was 500,000 and you had 4,000 employees and you were going for level 1, it would be 1.5 plus 2.5 plus 1, which would be 5 days. And I would refer you more specifically again to Appendix 3, page 10, and you can see those requirements. Are there any other questions? Dylan, was that you that was helping?
There was a question about whether there are any certified auditors outside the U.S. at this point. Maybe someone at SQF can help.
None that I'm aware of at this point. Bob, are you still on? Would you know?
No, Steve, there are not auditors outside the U.S. There are organizations. Of course, Silica does have operations in Mexico, and we've gotten a lot of interest from Mexican processors and growers, and the government are very interested in our ethical sourcing program. So it's not too distant future, we will have auditors coming in from Mexico. Actually, one of the certification bodies, ProCert, is actively involved also in Mexico, and hopefully they're going to come online very soon.
We did have an auditor from Mexico attend the last auditor training session, but I don't know if he has gone on and pursued approval or gained approval, but there at least was an attendee.
He was one of the people from ProServe, I believe.
Okay.
We have some questions regarding are retailers formally accepting this standard yet, and if so, how are they encouraging their suppliers to comply? So the answer to that would be they are not formally, they are accepting the standard, yes. They are currently not making it mandatory as they would for a GFSI certification. However, this is under the FMI umbrella, so we do have the ear and the voice of the retailers in mind when we put this standard together and launched it. So the goal is to eventually have them accept this as more of a requirement, but right now, no, it is not something that is formally required. Also, there's a question regarding can the label go on the product even though this certifies management systems? And that answer is no. Currently, the ethical sourcing certification label cannot go on the product. This certification is not product specific, as it more just certifies your management systems and commitment. Again, this webinar will be recorded and put up on our website, both the SQFI website and the SQFI ethical sourcing website. So if you wanted to share with your stakeholders, feel free to check back in about a week, and it should be on the website as well. Also, if you have any other questions regarding what you've heard today, feel free to either inbox them to info@sqfi.com or reach out to Bob or myself directly, or Steve Brown. We can funnel those questions to Steve as well. I know I don't think his contact information is not up on here, but we know him pretty well, so we can get those questions over to him. With that, if anyone has any other questions, if they could chat them in now. If not.
Yeah, I'd like just take a couple quick ones to finish up, Sarah.
Sure, go ahead.
There is a question about are there any plans to add humane treatment of animals to the code, and the answer is currently no. There's not been that discussion. I don't know there's any. There are already, I believe, standards that relate in that area, but not currently in this standard. And then just one other was that a company recently achieved certification as a Level 3 SQF certified food packaging manufacturing facility. And congratulations, I know that's not an easy task. How difficult would it be to become ES certified? That's a difficult one to answer because the devil is always in the details. You know, there's certainly you have good programs from a food safety and quality standpoint, et cetera, but how well you have established a supplier throughout your food chain, throughout your supply chain, how well you have established health, safety, environmental, et cetera, programs, social management programs in place can be very dependent. I've seen in the auditing that we did, one point that I forgot to mention earlier is we did several pilot audits. And, you know, I saw a variety of situations where some folks had some programs were very strong, others that weren't, some that had very good programs in place. So it just depends. I would say that's probably a good platform, but I can't give you a definitive answer. I would ask you to go to the website, take a look at the documents, and make that self-assessment yourself. If you have a desire for self-assessment, please contact SQFI, one of the certification bodies, and that could, I'm sure, be arranged if you wanted someone to come in and do a third-party gap analysis, if you will. I think that's all I can see here that I have, Sarah. So.
There's one more question here about, person said if the ES logo can't be used on packaging, then how are consumers supposed to be to know about it and to hear about it? Certainly, the logo of the ethical sourcing can be used in advertising and promotion. You certainly can promote the fact that your ethical sourcing, level 1, level 2, level 3 certified. That can be done. We're still contemplating the use of any kind of logo or standard or stamp on a packaging. You know, some of you may know that level 3 under the food code can use it on packaging, but we haven't gotten there on ethical sourcing yet. And again, it's a systems, it's not a product or process type of certification. It is a systems certification. So it certifies that the management system is reaching that level, not the particular product. So, you know, we're going to continue to look at that, but that doesn't stop you from using it in your promotion and advertising. Hope that answers your question. Any other questions that we have before we end?
All right, I think that's it.
Well, let's thank you all for attending and listening to us. And if you have any further questions, please direct them to the website and the areas that we discussed, or you can send Sarah or me a question. We'll be happy to answer. Thank you all for attending.